Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for coming. We can get started. Thank you for joining this session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today we have Michèle Mueller-Itten, who is going to talk to us about rational attention via ignorance equivalence, joint work with Rock, Armenter, and Zach Stangebye. The guest panelists are Alex Bloedel and Andrew Caplin. The format of this seminars is as follows. We have a 60-minute presentation with time for interim questions. We encourage the audience to participate. Please unmute yourselves and ask any questions. There will be also an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A session at the end, which is going to be for 15 minutes. Just to remind everyone that the talk is recorded. Before I hand over to Michèle, let me announce that the next talk is going to be by Teddy Mekonnen, who is going to talk about competition, persuasion, and search with Bobby Packard-Herson. And the guest panelists are Alessandro Bonatti and Mark Whitmire. Thank you, Michèle. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the two guest panelists. I'm going to talk to you today about rational inattention via ignorance equivalence. And as Piers already said, it is joint work with Rock from the Philly Fed and Zach, who's at University of Notre Dame. So I'm going to start with just what I see as the main contribution and what I hope you'll take away from this talk. Basically, my job in this hour will be to try to convince you that when an agent can learn, that's kind of as if that agent had access to additional payoff possibilities. So kind of that the ability to learn is as if he had actually a bigger menu sort of looming in the background. And that thinking about rational inattention this way can be helpful, both because it makes things more tractable and because it maybe enlarges our horizon as to how we think about it. Specifically, what we bring to the table is this notion of ignorance equivalent. This is a new thing that we define, and I will try to convince you that it acts as a parsimonious summary of the underlying decision problem and some key properties. And that this, as I said, this equivalence between the learning ability on one side and these fictional payoffs can simplify our analysis also in multiplayer settings. If we have time, I want to save some time at the end to get to multiplayer settings. To start with, though, it will be a pure decision theory problem with a single agent. So this is just a summary of rational inattention. This is not ours. I'm just using this here to introduce you to the notation that I'll use throughout and the types of graphs, which just to warn you are slightly different than what many of the rational inattention literature currently uses, but very much like what we would teach in an introductory microcourse. So we start with an agent who is choosing an action from some finite menu, and I'll denote by A. And each action, I'll just going to write directly as a payoff vector of how much utility will the agent get in each possible state of the world. So there are I states of the world. A subscript I denotes the utility that the agent gets if she implements this action in state I. And the agent also at the beginning doesn't know which state it is, but has some prior belief that I will denote by pi. And so the types of graphs that you'll see throughout and which I'll use to illustrate the key concepts always draw the states as axes and then just draw each action as the corresponding payoff vector. So to make this even more concrete, we could think about this decision maker being an investor, and she has to decide in which out of 3 portfolios she wants to put her money. Then there could be 2 states. The market could go up or the market could go down. And then I would draw each portfolio to add the corresponding payoffs. So this would be a pro-cyclical asset that pays off a lot in the goods. When the market goes up, this would be a counter-cyclical asset, which pays off more when the market goes down. And A2 would be more or less a safe asset here because it pays off the same in both states. So that's how we would think about these scenarios. And then we also know how to solve these problems. If we don't have any learning, we just do expected utility maximization. Graphically, that means we look at the direction of the agent's prior and we just take the highest action in that direction. And that will give us her choice. If we had instead incomplete information, we would use Bayes' rule first, would observe the signal. Let's say the signal is either plus or minus. Then she would update her belief according to Bayes' rule. So in what I have drawn here, the signal plus is indicative of state 1. So she gets more convinced that it's state 1. And then she still, again, maximizes expected utility under her posterior. And she would do that after each signal realization. Now, in a sense, what rational inattention does, it just adds one step at the beginning, which is that the agent first can choose which signal she even wants to observe, and more accurate signals are more costly. So she could pick the signal I just drew before, but she could also pick a less accurate signal, which you can see because it moves her beliefs less. So it's more noisy signal, but presumably that would be cheaper. And then she would choose something else. Again, she would maximize expected utility at her posterior. So that's fundamentally what a rationally inattentive agent does. And I'll write the overall welfare that she can get from this triplet, which is the menu of actions, her prior belief, and the cost function, as just the expected consumption utility that she gets with learning and then maximizing expected utility, minus what she has to pay for this particular signal. And this additive utility structure is also typical for rational intention problems. Now, what the agent is optimizing over here is a very, very large space, and that can cause some problems because technically this is a model of very flexible learning. She could literally pick any signal that she would want. We can simplify a little bit by the obedience principle. It's without loss of generality to assume that she chooses a direct learning strategy where the signal recommends an action and she then chooses that action. And so I'll write these in the following way. I'll just use QIA for the conditional probability that she'll choose action A in state I. And so basically, all these learning strategy is what she's optimizing over, and each such learning strategy has an associated cost. Now, in the paper, we specifically write down what properties the cost function must have. I'll briefly go over them for more detail. I unfortunately have to refer you to the paper. But the first assumption is just a continuity assumption. We assume that the costs do not jump, they're finite everywhere. We also assume that she can freely dispose of information, which is on one hand, the Blackwell monotonicity, more accurate signals are more costly. And also we'll assume that if she gets some free information, it can never make a specific signal more expensive for her. So exogenous information can never harm her, which corresponds to prior concavity of the cost function. The third assumption that we make is that we assume that there is sort of a zero marginal cost of learning to start with. Formally, what we mean is if there are two actions that she's exactly indifferent between, but they're not equal payoffs in all states, it's just the same expected utility, then she will always learn at least a little bit. That's the third assumption. And the fourth assumption is really closely related to one of Alex and Wage's papers. We assume that sequential information acquisition brings no cost savings. So if she has some signal in mind, and she could break it up by saying, I first draw one, like more core signal, and then depending on what I find, I take another signal. It cannot be that the sequential implementation is cheaper. Or another way of saying it, if there were such sequential savings, she just already incorporate them. And this learning cost that we're talking about is already after optimizing overall possible sequential implementations. These are the four properties that we'll assume throughout. For some results, we'll assume a fifth assumption, which in my mind is the least appealing assumption, which is that not only does she not save by such a sequential implementation, it's also not more costly. So she's exactly indifferent in the end across all sequential information acquisition strategies. Whenever I have a result that depends on that one, I'll mark it with a little star. But even if we assume all five, that still contains all smooth and prior concave uniformly posterior separable costs. So you can also, if you prefer, just think about one of those costs, which includes several of the examples in the literature. They would all fit within our framework. All right, that's rational intention and sort of the setup of the problem. Now I want to define what this ignorance equivalent is. So again, we start with the rational intention problem, menu, prior, and cost function, and then we define ignorance equivalent as a single payoff vector. So you can think of this ignorance equivalent as sort of an additional fictitious action or fictitious payoff vector that has two properties. The first property is that this signal should be, or this action, this payoff vector should be attractive enough that the agent is willing to commit to always implement it. What do I mean with she would be willing to commit to always implement it is, I mean, if I would give her the choice between two menus, one where she only has access to that action, and she has to therefore implement it, and one where she has access to her previous menu, then she would be willing to pick the menu that forces her to implement her action. So her welfare from that menu must be at least as big as her welfare from the original menu. Another way of saying it is that the agent is willing to forgo any learning opportunities that are present in her menu. Now, that will be satisfied as long as the payoff vector is good enough. There is an opposite inequality, which is that the agent must also be willing to commit to never implement this payoff vector. Now, never implement means that I have to compare her original menu and the menu where I added to the menu. When I take a union of the two, this allows her the opportunity to either always implement it or sometimes implement it, or never. And if she gets no added benefit from adding it when I add it, she can do more, of course, when I add this option. But if this inequality holds, she's no better off when I add the option to the menu, then I'll say she's willing to commit to never implement it. And another way of saying that is that she's not only willing to forgo the learning opportunities that are already present, but also the learning opportunities that sort of newly arise when I add this ignorance equivalent, when I add this new payoff vector. Now, I've stated it all with inequalities. In case that throws you off, I want to point out it doesn't really matter. With rational intention, bigger menus are always better. So whenever these two hold with a weak inequality, they in fact hold with an equality. So another way of stating it is that the ignorance equivalent is a payoff vector that has the property that the agent is exactly indifferent between these three menus, given her prior belief and given her cost function. Now, the first important result is that this definition is not vacuous. Such an ignorance equivalent always exists and in fact is unique. And so it can be constructed from an optimal signal. Instead of giving you the full proof, I want to show you how we would construct it. So let's go back to our picture from before. I'll assume only two states and two actions. That's the easiest I could do. And let's assume that we know what the optimal behavior here is. Let's assume for simplicity that the optimal choice is such that the agent always implements the better action 90% of the time. So she's not taking a fully informative signal, but she makes it so that she achieves 90% accuracy. Then I can write down in each state what will be her expected consumption utility. Conditional on state 1, she'll 90% of the time choose A1 and 10% of the time choose A2. So this point here will be 90% to the right and also 90% up, because the same is true in state 2. So this point captures her expected consumption utility. That's not expected welfare because, of course, she also has to pay for the signal. So if I want to get to her actual welfare, I'd have to take the expected utility, so the point through this consumption vector, and then subtract the cost of that signal from it. I can do that at her prior. I could do that at any belief to figure out how useful is this particular signal at any possible belief. And that will give me a bunch of lines like this. If I do that for all beliefs, I'll eventually get a curve like that. And now I'll say that this particular signal dominates all payoff vectors that are either below or on this line. And dominance means really, no matter what my belief is, I'd rather follow this learning strategy S than pick this payoff vector. Okay, so any dominated payoff vector, and regardless of your initial belief, you'd be better off following this signal and making this much welfare than just implementing the payoff vector unconditionally. Now, once you have done that, the ignorance equivalent is in fact the best dominated payoff vector. And from here, we have the two properties from the definition. If you unconditionally implement this alpha, then because it is, we have to show this, but the picture illustrates it, I should say. Because it is just as good as the signal, it lies, in fact, on this line, and this has a lot to do with the prior concavity. It is just as good as the optimal signal under your prior, but it is also no better than the signal under any belief, which means it cannot improve your utility when you add it to the menu, because it can never be that at whatever belief you'd be better off implementing this action than just following this learning strategy S, which you rely only on your original menu. So that's why when we add it, it also doesn't generate any new learning opportunities. Once you have the ignorance equivalent, it helps you identify all optimal signals. In fact, all optimal signals have the property that they dominate the ignorance equivalent. So it could be that the rational inattention problem has multiple optimal strategies, but there will always be a single ignorance equivalent. And if there are multiple, you'll see that they are all optimal because they'll all dominate the ignorance equivalent. A strategy that's not optimal would look something like that. So if you draw the dominated payoff vectors, it would not include alpha. Now, from this construction, we can also then move on. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide. In case you're coming from the posterior-based approach, and you're like, what is this new pictures everywhere? I want to know what this looks like when I draw beliefs on the axis as I'm used to. In this case, this is my one slide to explain it to you. So with posterior beliefs, posterior approach, the way it would work is you would draw on the x-axis your posterior belief. How likely do you think it is that state one or state 1 or state 2? And then each possible action becomes, in fact, a line that says how much expected utility do you get under that particular posterior. And the way that the construction typically works is that you would draw these lines for each action, then you subtract the cost potential, and you get what's being termed the net payoffs. Then you concavify over everything. By the way, if this does not say anything to you, don't worry, I'm not going to come back to it. This is just for people who are already used to this. So you'd concavify, and then you'd look, you'd subtract it, you'd add the cost potential again. So you're sort of back to what would be the equivalent no learning utilities. And then you could find the ignorance equivalent as the supporting hyperplane at your belief. So if you do this construction this way, you'd have the ignorance equivalent payoffs on both sides of that line that supports the upper envelope taken back without the potential again. All right. Now,
can I jump in with a small question about the previous slide? So just to relate this to concepts that are sort of out there in other papers. So focusing on the posterior separable case, it seems like the ignorance equivalent vector is related to the Lagrange multiplier that one would put on the Bayes plausibility constraint.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes, there is definitely a connection. So, and then a referee pointed this out before. So I should say, I said all these properties have to hold, which restricts us more or less to UPS cost functions. You can construct, because you can use this construction, you can construct an ignorance equivalent more generally for posterior separable cost functions. But I'm not a fan of papers that have new assumptions pop up everywhere when you have a new result. So I just made the assumptions, and then within that set that I outlined in the beginning, all the properties will also follow. So I'll focus on it that way, but you're absolutely correct.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. So some properties of the ignorance equivalent, why I think it's a helpful summary statistic. First of all, I said this before, it characterizes the optimal learning strategies. But in a sense, it does so without referring to beliefs, right? You just have to see for a particular learning strategy, which payoff vector does it dominate? In particular, does it dominate the ignorance equivalent? And dominance is a prior-free concept because it's across all priors. And so what that means in particular is that if you have two different agents that have the same menu and cost, but have different prior beliefs, as long as they have the same ignorance equivalent, they'll also have the same set of optimal learning strategies. Now, I think I need to make an important distinction here. We characterize learning strategies as the state-dependent choices for choosing actions. So it would be the state-dependent stochastic choice data. So what we're saying is if two people have the same ignorance equivalent, they would have the same state-dependent stochastic choice data. That is not the same as the condition about locally invariant posteriors, because these two people that started out with different beliefs, even if they have the same state stochastic choice data, they will have different posteriors at the point where they implement the different actions. Okay, so this is a different result in that sense. The second part where you could use the ignorance equivalent is to try to figure out what are the welfare consequences if you give a new option to an agent. So you might want to know, is this agent made any better off when I introduce a new action to the menu? That's kind of a hard question because it could be, we know this from previous literature, because the agent can learn, you can even add an action that has a very low ex ante expected utility, but it could still make them better off because it might make it worthwhile to learn. And then it might enhance their welfare through that way. So a priori, if you would like to answer that question, you'd have to think about all learning strategies in this new menu that could be possible. And if you have a lot of actions, that's a very highly dimensional object. It turns out that the ignorance equivalent is, in a sense, sufficient to figure out whether the agent can benefit or not. So we have this result that says the new action adds welfare to the whole menu, if and only if it also adds welfare when you add it to just the ignorance equivalent by itself. So you can forget about the other actions that are there. You can pretend it was just the ignorance equivalent, check if the agent's made better off, and the yes or no question will have the same answer in both cases. You might have bigger welfare gains here because you have more actions to sort of draw on, but if there are welfare gains, the yes or no question is if and only if with the ignorance equivalent. You can sort of abstract away from the complexity. Now, one criticism that comes often is that the ignorance equivalent, of course, is related to the optimal learning strategy. And so in that sense, there is no closed form solution or no closed form formula to figure out where the ignorance equivalent lies. And that is true. There is typically no closed form solution to the optimal behavior in rational inattention problems. And as much as I would like, we cannot change that fact. And so we can also not give you a closed form solution for what the ignorance equivalent is. Once you have the ignorance equivalent, it's easy to figure out what the optimal learning strategy is. But that does not typically lend itself to just a formula. But what's nice is that once you have a candidate point that you think might be the ignorance equivalent, you can in fact verify whether that is correct using only binary learning strategies. So instead of having to check that indeed there is no learning strategy at all over the whole menu plus this action that could make you better off, you can check only whether this ignorance equivalent makes you better off when you add it to just one of the actions. So if you just add the ignorance equivalent to one, or if you compare the ignorance equivalent in just one of the existing actions, and always the ignorance equivalent is chosen unconditionally, then it's also true that it would be chosen unconditionally from the big menu. So you don't have to think about the big menu in more complicated learning strategy. You can just verify it thinking only about binary learning strategies at a time. Now, this is an over full slide, I apologize. But the last property here is about what happens when you add the ignorance equivalent to the menu. We already know it doesn't make you any better off. That's by definition. But maybe it could be that it would make somebody else better off because if they have a different prior. So what we want to ask here is what happens if I have, let's say, two people, again, same menu, same cost function, but different prior. And contrary to corollary one, we're not in the situation where they have the same ignorance equivalent. They both have different ignorance equivalents. Person A has some ignorance equivalent, And what happens if we add the ignorance equivalent for that person to the other person's menu? Then a priori, we have no guarantee that they could not make them better off. But it turns out that's not the case. So if we add any ignorance equivalent to the menu, even for other prior beliefs, it will not make them better off. And it will not sort of distort their learning, meaning what they did before is still optimal. Let me give you a little intuition for why this is the case. So here I've drawn the same picture as before. This is my original problem. Let's say this is my optimal learning strategy under my prior belief. And this is some other person who has prior belief pi prime. And that is their ignorance equivalent. So the two of us have different beliefs, and we would also behave differently because we have different ignorance equivalents. But what I want to think about now is what happens if you add alpha prime to my menu? Could it make me better off? The argument is that no, it cannot make me better off, because suppose for a second that it did. Suppose it somehow made me better off. I found this complicated learning strategy and it involves alpha prime. And just as I'm about to implement alpha prime, you say, hey, stop, wait a second. In fact, this alpha prime by construction is dominated by some strategy S prime, the one that's optimal for the other dude with prior pi prime. But there is a learning strategy that dominates it. You don't know anything about the current belief I'm at because I've had all this learning done in the past already, right? But you know, because it's of dominance, S prime is better or as good as implementing alpha prime, regardless of what belief I have. And I would agree with you. And I would say, okay, actually, I don't necessarily need to implement alpha prime. I could just follow strategy S prime. It will be just as good. And strategy S prime only relies on the original actions in the menu. So therefore, it cannot make me better off when you add somebody else's ignorance equivalent. Now that's nice because then we can sort of go to the extreme. Rather than just adding one ignorance equivalent, we could just add them all. So just add all the ignorance equivalents across all prior beliefs to the menu. And then you get something that looks like this green construction here, which we call the learning proof menu. And the learning proof menu, you can think of so either you construct it by collecting all the ignorance equivalents across all prior beliefs, or you could also construct it from the dominance relationships by drawing that for each possible signal and then taking the upper envelope. The nice thing is that it's kind of like an expected utility representation of the problem with learning. With learning, the agent is just as well off as if he had the green. So with learning and only the black dots, the agent is always just as well off as if he could not learn, but had access to the green menu, to the learning proof menu. Moreover, if he indeed did have access to the learning proof menu, he would be like learning is sort of mute because he cannot benefit anymore from having the ability to learn. So we can sort of recast the problem with learning. Again, it's actually very tedious and complicated to think about it because learning is just this optimization over this highly dimensional learning strategies. And so just drawing a menu conceptually is much nicer because we can sort of picture it and now we can sort of forget about learning. We can just think about in the first step, what would be the optimal choice from here. And then once we have found the ignorance equivalent by just maximizing expected utility over the screen menu, we could go back if we want to, if we care about the behavior and figure out which strategies dominated. And those would be optimal. Now, a quick and easy example where this might be helpful would be for belief elicitation. So if you would like to know what is the agent's prior belief, you don't know it, but you would like to know, one thing you could do is you could offer them the learning proof menu or a learning proof menu. If you do that and they pick this action, you know for sure that is their prior belief, the one that's orthogonal there. You can't do that if you have a learning if you have a menu that's not learning proof, because then before you can see which action they choose, they might have already done learning, and then you can no longer observe their true prior, you can only observe a posterior.
I would just like to comment that there's a lot of learning that the outside agent has to do to construct the learning proof menu to find a way to then elicit the prior.
So here we assume he knows the cost
think of this
function.
as like, I don't think of this as a cookbook I could use right now.
So it does assume that you know the cost function, of course, which might be a big assumption. Well, in this paper, one that we make throughout. I'm currently working on something to use sort of similar ideas to elicit the cost function.
That's what I would think. My own take is that a great use of this would be elicitation.
Yes.
And I also would like to comment that I don't believe for a second that you'd get the same cost function that you would by the other methods of recovering costs. Because I think there's a common fantasy we've all used in RI that people kind of know their costs. And I think that we would find some very interesting unopened boxes down there.
Yes.
And what I like the idea of is running various different elicitations. And using the differences between them. We should definitely
talk more.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I said this is sort of just an easy application. We assume the agent knows the cost. This is a way for them to elicit the prior. But of course, maybe the more interesting or definitely a bigger question is, could it be used to figure out the cost function and possibly the prior too? There are possibilities in this right direction. It's just not this paper. Another example to highlight how the learning proof menu can at least sort of conceptually be useful is if you want to figure out how useful is it for the agent if I give them for free some exogenous information. That also, I just want to highlight that it's not a clean or easy answer per se, because when you give an agent who has the ability to learn, when you give them for free some information, three things can happen. Either the information that you give them was information that they would have gone and acquired themselves anyway, in which case it wouldn't affect their behavior, but it would make it cheaper for them because they don't have to go out and seek the information. It could be that it complements the information that they would have sought out, in which case they might now be more accurate, but have the same cost of learning, any combination of the two, of course. But it could also be that you're just giving them information that's not useful for them, given the payoff possibility, given the menu that they have. And so you'd have to really sort of figure out what is their optimal choice to figure out how much better off are they with information. But here, if we have sort of recasted everything without learning or as if without learning, then you can just do the standard thing where you take the posteriors and you see how much higher are they when they can choose after observing this free information. Now, another interesting area is with respect to the consideration set. So the literature calls the consideration set the set of actions that are chosen with positive probability by a rationally inattentive agent. Some things that we know already is that typically, even though the agent might have access to a whole lot of options, they only actually choose actions in a very small subset. And there might even be a continuous underlying problem. They only choose actions from a finite set. And we know that the comparative statics of these consideration sets are anything but simple. In fact, for example, we might find actions in these consideration sets that ex ante don't look even that attractive because under the prior, they don't have that high expected utility, but they might be a good sort of learning complement with another action in the menu, and so they might still be chosen with positive probability. We also know sort of by example that it can happen that an action that was previously never chosen suddenly gets chosen when we add a new action. So Mateka and McKay show that you can have to show an example where there's an action that's never chosen in a menu, and then you add a new action, here depicted as this plus here, and suddenly the agent would switch to using this gray action here. So those things can happen. We know that. But now it might be interesting to ask ourselves which actions have the potential of becoming part of the consideration set in this way. And here the learning proof menu can be helpful too. In particular, if you look at the intersection between the learning proof menu and your original menu, you get what we refer to as the anchor actions. So those are all those that are also on the learning proof menu. They, in some sense, form a latent consideration set. I'm summarizing here a little bit from the theorem in the paper, but the three most interesting aspects, I think, that make this point the best are, first of all, if you look at the actual consideration set in a particular problem, it's always a subset of the anchor actions. So only anchor actions ever get chosen, which if you follow the construction is sort of obvious. If you change the prior belief, you can activate any of the anchor actions. You can make any of the anchor actions being chosen with positive probability. In fact, you can even make any, if you choose just the right prior, you can make any of them be implemented with full probability. Now, that's if you can change the belief. In some applications, that might not be a sensible thing, that you can somehow manipulate the beliefs of your agent. But what I think is more interesting is that if we instead think about menu expansion, just adding a new action and trying to think through the Mateka-McKay exercise, can we activate an action just by adding another action to the menu, but keeping the belief the same? The answer is also, yes, it's exactly the anchor actions that can be activated in this way. So for each anchor action, you can add a complement, a new action that would make them be chosen with positive probability. And so in that sense, it's sort of the largest consideration set, or the union of all consideration sets that can happen when you either mess around with beliefs or you add new actions. All right. Now, the big claim, the big hope is that at some point, the ignorance equivalent can sort of play the role of the certainty equivalent, but for situations with learning. Now, we all know the certainty equivalent. Certainty equivalent is really helpful because it condenses the appeal of a lottery into just a scalar. We know that it's very useful to compare across lotteries given a fixed belief, to compare against risk aversion and whatnot. We also know it arises in real applications, for example, as the price of insurance. But the certainty equivalent isn't that helpful when we want to think about situations with learning, because it's kind of too parsimonious in that sense. It abstracts away from all state dependency. It just takes the vector of payoffs and then condenses them in a scalar. But when you learn, it's this tailoring of action to state that's just the focus, that takes center stage. And so if you just know sort of, on average, how good is each action, you cannot figure out, or you can no longer capture what the agent would learn in the original problem where there are state-dependent payoffs. The ignorance equivalent goes, in a sense, a step less far, but it still condenses. It takes the entire menu of possibly many actions and summarizes them in just one payoff vector. But this payoff vector is still state-dependent. So it still keeps that part, and in that sense, sort of retains just enough detail to capture the learning opportunities that are inherent in the original menu. And as I hope I have somehow convinced you with the previous examples, is that it can be helpful when we want to compare across signals, figuring out, for example, whether two agents use the same learning strategy or not, compare across menus to figure out whether adding an action would be welfare enhancing or not, and across beliefs to figure out whether the first example sort of capture both. If we change beliefs but keep the same ignorance equivalent, what does that mean for behavior? Or if we don't keep the same ignorance equivalent, what does that mean for optimal behavior? But that's not all. So it's not just a tool for tractability. I think it can do that, but I think it also is more than that. It has economic relevance, and we might expect to actually see it in the real world. In particular, we might expect that we can sort of see, or that the ignorance equivalent emerges in situations where the menu of an agent is designed strategically. So I'm going to go back to my toy example here with my investor who wants to invest into 1 out of 3 portfolios. In that example, what would be the ignorance equivalent? So you can learn before investing. The ignorance equivalent in that case would also be a portfolio with state-dependent returns that has 2 properties. First of all, she would be willing to unconditionally pick this portfolio alpha instead of going out and first learning. But by doing so, it would also make her no better off. So it makes her just as well off as if she would learn and then pick either, in this case, A1 or A3. And now we introduce a second person. We introduce an informed fund manager. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that he knows which state it is. He can learn for free. And he can offer any payouts that he wants. He can say, if you give me your money, here's how much I pay you in state 1, here's how much I'll pay you in state 2. Now, in this case, the payoff vector or the fund that he wants to offer is in fact exactly the ignorance equivalent. Why is it the ignorance equivalent? First of all, it will make sure he always gets the investor's money. Second of all, it avoids adverse selection because learning from the investor is really bad for the manager because if she goes out and learns, she comes back to him only in cases where it's good for her and bad for him. This is a zero-sum game. So he does not want her to learn because it would generate adverse selection. It's also good because it reveals no free information. If he would first learn the state and then offer something conditional on what he has found, she could learn into his strategic offer and learn some information for free, which again would create adverse selection. Lastly, it's actually also socially optimal because if he offers this payoff vector, given that the investor has a cost of learning, she would not learn, and all the learning would be done by, in this case, the the fund manager, who is, after all, being able to learn for free. So what we want to do is we want to take this idea. Oh, we get one more step. First, let's stay with the example a little while longer. We can complicate it a little bit. Let's assume for realism that the fund manager actually doesn't know her prior belief. So we'll still assume he knows the cost function. So he can know where the ignorance equivalent is, or where he can know the cost function, but he doesn't know her prior belief. He doesn't know exactly what likelihood she assigns to the market going up or going down. In this case, he could still do something. He could just offer her the learning proof menu. Because of self-selection, he knows that this would not make her any better off regardless of her belief, and she would always choose the actual ignorance equivalent. So he would be just fine. He can offer this and there is the self-selection. She will just pick the ignorance equivalent that's right for her. That's the basic idea, but we want to generalize it now in several dimensions. And so I'm going to call this optimal allocation of an opportunity. So suppose that we have many different irrationally inattentive agents, and we have a single opportunity that we have to allocate to one of them. Allocating the opportunity means they get to choose one of their actions. That's what the opportunity allows them to do. But which agent should even have the opportunity and which action they should choose, of course, might depend on what their learning cost is, what the opportunities are. And so we want to figure out whether we can describe what the first best solution would be, and then whether the agents can achieve this first best surplus through trade. The key complication here is that, of course, there's learning. And so agents can at any point of time can choose to learn when they already own the opportunity, when they should really hand over the opportunity to somebody else, when they're supposed to accept the opportunity. So the trade really needs to take into account a lot of possible deviations to learning. And we want to figure out, despite that, can we find a protocol that makes it work? We consider sort of two scenarios here. The first scenario, we assume that there is one single agent that is the most able. So that agent has a lower cost of learning for any signal. And also, this agent has a bigger menu than anybody else. Anybody else's menu is contained in its own menu. You can think about this as a generalization of the investor example, where the investor doesn't learn for free, but for cheaper than the agent. And maybe the investor has to reinvest and he has access to the same investment vehicles as the investor, but it maybe additionally has some additional ones that are only open to professionals. In that situation, we can construct a full set of terms that implement the first best, talk a little bit about how the bargaining power affects which terms are being chosen, and we can sort of generalize it this way. This goes in the direction of a nice Kramer and Khalil paper that without flexible learning, but just very crude learning where you can either pay and know the state or not pay and not know the state. But what they show is that this ability to learn can affect the terms of the equilibrium trade, even when there is no learning on path. And so we sort of generalize this for flexible learning a la rational inattention. The part that I'm more excited about actually does not make this assumption that one agent is just unilaterally the best, but that different agents might have different comparative advantages. Maybe some agents have a bigger menu than others, so giving them the opportunity allows them to choose from more things. Maybe one agent is particularly good about distinguishing between states 1 and 2 because that's his expertise. Another agent is better at distinguishing between states 4 and 5. So their cost functions don't need to be ordered. So it could be that they really have to sort of work together to achieve the first best. You can think, if you want a concrete example, you could think about a Teams problem where they have to buy some new software for the firm. And there are many possible stakeholders, and some people are really good about figuring out people's needs. Other people are really good about figuring out the cheapest way to get a software. Other people actually have the connections where they can buy the software. And we want to figure out, can they somehow work together in a decentralized way to implement the first best? So we want to add a little bit more formality. We have these K agents. We have a single opportunity, and the agent that ultimately executes the opportunity can choose one of the actions in his menu and will enjoy the corresponding payout. All other actions receive payoff of 0. Now, if we want to think about the first best, we think about a social planner who can dictate to everybody what they should do. So the social planner, in essence, then has access to all actions that anybody has, the whole union of all menus. And he also has access to all learning technologies. So all the possible costs, she can choose a selection or a contingency plan of what each agent should learn in what sequence and depending on what earlier agents have found. And this holds contingency plan of what people should do when and after what. Drawing on the Bloedel and Song paper, they have really done the work for us here. Essentially, what the planner has is the indirect cost that comes out when she has access to, when she can implement each signal at the cheapest of these K costs, and she can optimize sequentially. And so that means that the planner can generate a social surplus given by the welfare that she can achieve when she has access to everybody's actions, all the learning technologies, and some prior, minus what would happen if just the first agent executes the opportunity by himself. Then he just is restricted to his own menu and his own cost. And so the question that you want to ask is, can agents achieve the same surplus through trading the opportunity back and forth? And if so, how? Now, we're going to assume that all agents initially share the common prior about the state. The opportunity initially is with agent 1, but they can transfer it as long as it has not been executed. A trade specifically will be, I give you the opportunity, but you in turn promise me some payment, and the payment can be state dependent. So an trade between two agents is always specified by a transfer vector. Both have to agree to the trade to happen. And if they both agree, then agent K releases the opportunity to agent L, who in turn will pay him once the state realizes at the end of the game. So these are the types of trades that can be done. The complication, again, is that agents can learn at any time. So relevant, so first of all, each has possibly different cost functions that they can use their signals for. But they can also learn whether or not they currently own the technology. So they don't need the opportunity. They don't need to own the opportunity to learn. They can learn before they accept a trade, for example. And also learning doesn't somehow execute the opportunity. So the opportunity is only executed when you actually choose an action. Okay. Now, if there is no most capable agent, the first best typically is quite complicated. It might be something like, Michèle, go out and learn this. If you find A, then hand the opportunity over to Andrew, who will go find out some more information. Depending on what he finds, he might either tell Alex to go pick an action or tell somebody else to go learn some more. that might be the first best plan. Now, the planner could just tell people what to do, but can they do it in a decentralized way? We'll have to do, in this case, one additional assumption, which we share with, for example, the Yoder paper. We assume that learning produces hard information. So you can, when you learn something, everybody observes what you have learned. And we do that for tractability, but also it has the nice, what it helps us is to focus really on the learning incentives rather than on the truth-telling incentives. So you don't have to tell about what you found. What you found is obvious for everybody. Tractability is improved because that ensures that always agents will have a common public belief. So that is a restriction on the applications. But if we have that, we can then ask our question, and the answer is yes. In fact, we can show that the following is a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. First of all, the terms at which agents would be willing to trade are given by the learning proof menu of the planner. So you sort of think about what the learning proof menu of the planner is, and the terms are always just the ones that maximize when you maximize in the direction of the current belief. And then once you have sort of specified what are the potential terms at which agents would be willing to accept offers, then in fact it becomes optimal for them to just follow step by step exactly the plan that the planner would have laid out. So at each point, if they are to do something and they already have the opportunity, they would just be willing to do it. And then when it's no longer their turn to either learn or implement, they would hand the opportunity over according to these terms. So I have here a graph. I think this might be easier. So here I have a two-state problem. Agent 1 has these 3 actions. I just drew them here as black points, and I sketched the learning proof menu for agent 1 just to give you an indication of what his learning cost is. And then I introduce a different agent. This agent has a different menu altogether. He has the green points here. And I also hinted as his learning proof menu. You can see that his learning proof menu is much more curved than agent 1's. So that can mean that he can learn cheaper. Okay, so agent 2 seems the more able agent in this case. Now, I want to make clear, first of all, you could think about multiple dimensions, and one of them might be better in one dimension and the other is sort of distinguishing other dimensions. But also learning, being better or worse at learning, I think when we say it in words, it seems like this one-dimensional, you're either good or you're bad at it. But the tricky thing is that in these rational inattention problems, you can really be very good at, it can be very cheap for you to acquire certain signals and expensive to acquire other signals. So there can be relative advantages in learning. Now here, for simplicity, let's just assume the screen agent can learn cheaper. And then what we would do is we would figure out what does the learning proof menu of the principal look like, of the social planner. So social planner would have all these points and would have the indirect cost given by the minimum of the 2 cost functions from the minimum, generated from the minimum of the 2 cost functions. And we could draw this out here as a dashed line. And so what the result would mean is that if it is optimal for the social planner, so in the beginning, agent 1 has the opportunity. The social planner would like agent 2 to learn something because agent 2 is more able to learn something. Then agent 1 would have to hand over the opportunity to agent 2. They would be willing to do that at the terms that are given here. You just go in the direction of their common prior and say here, and you say, okay, agent 1, hand over the opportunity to agent 2 for this promise of transfers. Agent 1 will be willing to do it. Agent 2 would be willing to accept. Then agent 2 would acquire the information, or the principal would ask agent 2 to please acquire the information that he would like him to acquire. Agent 2 would say, oh, that's in fact also in my own best interest. I would be willing to acquire that information. For example, information that gets us either to this posterior or to this posterior, because that's what it looks like the optimal thing for the social planner would be. And then in this case, if he finds this result here, if he ends up at this posterior, it would be agent 2 who should implement it. He would be willing to do it. If he finds this result here, he should hand it back over to agent 1, who would then choose an action. And so again, they would trade the opportunity back, in this case, at the terms perpendicular or maximal in this direction. He would just basically pay out agent 1, who would then get the opportunity and implement this black dot. But in multiple dimensions, of course, this can be done many times, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so I think the takeaway from this exercise is that when agents have this uneven access to actions, they have different menus altogether that they could choose from. They have heterogeneous learning acuity. Some may be just better at learning than others. But maybe also it's not even just better or worse. They have some sort of specialized learning expertise. Then the first best might be very complicated and require a lot of patients to sort of work in step to just achieve the best way of figuring out what we should do and then doing it. Yet what our result says is that the planner does not actually have to micromanage. She doesn't have to figure out sort of a plan that makes each of her workers, gives them just the right incentives to do just the right thing when she would like them to. She can just, as long as she can make it possible for agents to make these state contingent contracts, to somehow commit to paying out the other agent at the end of the day when the state realizes, then workers can effectively organize themselves and trade can allow them to get as good as the first best. That's my example here. Are there any questions? Then I'll go to the conclusion slide. I hope that even though I spoke too fast, you were able to follow along, and I have convinced you that this ignorance equivalent approach to rational inattention might be intriguing for three reasons, essentially. First of all, because it can simplify our intuition when we think about these problems, when we can think about an easier sort of as-if scenario without learning. Second, it also yields some novel insights, be that for whether or not menu expansion makes the agent better off, or what happens when we change the prior in some way, whether that affects the behavior or not. And that it's an economically relevant concept. That's not just a shortcut, but that we might actually expect to find in equilibria of games when learning is to be avoided. For example, if you want to elicit prior beliefs, or when you're a fund manager and you don't want your investors to go out and create adverse selection problems, but not only then. So in this last example with the comparative learning, comparative advantages in learning, really you might find the ignorance equivalent sort of being used over and over and over again in the optimal implementation, just not to sort of actually get agents to have the right incentives, to get the agents' incentives aligned with the social planners. Even their ignorance equivalence, despite its name, can be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michèle. It was very interesting. Maybe now I'm going to ask first Alex if he has any comments or questions, and then Andrew.
Sure. So first of all, this is very exciting stuff. Rational inattention problems are very important, but also very hard to solve typically. So this is a really nice shift in conceptual perspective that seems to be shedding light on a lot of interesting applications of rational inattention that seem a priori sort of disconnected. So this is great stuff. So I have a couple questions. Some just for clarification, some that might be useful for thinking about extensions and such. So let's see. So first, I was curious. So this is something you guys have thought about in your other QE paper. In the case of Shannon's entropy, there's this well-known auxiliary maximization problem where it's as if the agent isn't learning and they're just picking the unconditional distribution over actions subject to some like transformed payoff vectors. Is there a relation between the ignorance equivalence construction and that auxiliary problem in the special case of Shannon?
So yes, in that case, so in our paper specifically, we sort of recast each payoff vector as an attention vector and then compute the optimal attention vector. it's sort of like a transformation of payoffs that allows us to use just convex optimization to figure out the optimal attention vector. And then if you take the pre-image again through the same mapping, you would get the ignorance equivalent.
I see.
So,
okay.
Yes. And so I'm pretty sure this could be generalized to other cost functions because the approach is very similar. And it might also in that sense help us not to get a closed form solution, but to get faster algorithms to determine the optimal behavior for UPS functions.
I see.
Go as far as Pussy or separable because you need like these starred results to make it work well.
Right. And so, okay, so then in the application of anchor actions to consideration sets, this seems potentially very exciting because typically finding the optimal consideration sets can be very difficult and sort of example specific. I'm wondering if there's like a particular class of problems where you can use these techniques to place some upper bound on the number of anchor actions or the structure of the set of anchor actions that would then help simplify finding the optimal consideration sets.
So to the first question, I don't think it can be an upper bound to the set of anchor actions because if you take the learning proof menu, you could always just add points on it. They would automatically be anchor actions. But if you take the green line and just add more points on that green line, you can put as many as you want. They would all be anchor actions, and so they would all be optimal in some rational intention problem under some prior.
I see.
If there is some structure, I mean, yes, the cost function is very intimately connected to sort of the curvature of the learning proof menu piecewise, right? And so that's maybe we can sort of come back to also Andrew's question, how you could use this approach to identify the cost function. So what I'm currently doing is an experimental protocol. It works in theory. I haven't tested it yet. But the idea is to sort of figure out what are the payoffs that make you no better off than just having zero, for example. And so you could sort of characterize the whole, the union of all payoff vectors that make you no better off if you just have zero and that one action. And that would give you, it would look a little bit like the lines that you have seen for the dominance. It would give you some shape. And from that shape, you could then back out fairly easily the potential of the UPS function, for example. And so
I see.
there is a tight connection between the cost function and the shape, how bulgy it is. That's also why people that are able to learn it bulges out more the learning proof menu.
Right.
So those two are intimately connected.
I see. And then a more speculative question. So the multi-agent application to trading opportunities is really nice and already I think highly non-trivial. Have you guys thought about whether the ignorance equivalent would be useful for studying multi-agent settings where the first best is not implementable, and for characterizing some properties of the second best trading arrangements or mechanisms?
So we haven't gotten very far. What we have tried, for example, is thinking about situations where so where it came up is where we think about situations where we could possibly have different beliefs at some point. Then I think at that point, I'm not so confident that we could still implement the first best. And it would also be relevant if just the learning does not produce hard information. So then I could sort of think about lying, and then you might have a different belief. Who knows?
Right.
Because as soon as we also differ in beliefs, there is sort of two things that are going on. Like if we just think about the investor and the manager, for example, to take a simple example, if they don't share initially the same belief, the manager at some point, to some extent, just wants to discourage learning as now, but also it's just inherently cheaper for him to promise something in some states that he believes are unlikely, but the investor thinks are likely. So these two things sort of work with each other, and it's hard to know which one's dominant, or sort of is a mixture of those two effects then. So that direction might be a way where then the first best is not implementable, but they don't have, I haven't found something useful to say really. I don't know if you have other settings in mind where the first best is not implementable.
No. I was also I was asking this speculatively because in these in multi-agent design settings where you allow for sequential mechanisms and things like this, the second best is typically extremely complicated. Yeah. So I think no specific settings in mind, but the fact that you're already able to characterize settings for the first best is implementable is really nice.
I mean, one thing that I'm currently thinking about more is also if we sort of combine it with Bayesian persuasion. So in Bayesian persuasion, you have the sender that just purely sends a signal, and it, like Bayesian persuasion, but with receiver learning. And so now you could, if you combine these two somehow, and you could say like the sender can either just send some information and hope to persuade the receiver to take a different action. What if he could also suggest actions, like sort of if we combine, if he can put forth a new option, or he can just provide information, which of the two would he prefer in what situations? There, I think we have, there are some interesting results. Not quite sure that it's very exploratory, so we should talk offline.
Yeah.
But there, I think we possibly they could be interesting, and there I have some things to say. But more generally, interesting, but I don't have something useful.
Great, thank you. I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Yeah, so I want to congratulate you on it's hard to find new ways into a literature that should have been developed in 1960. Bluntly, I don't know how we missed out on this for so long. I mean, rational inattention is simply, if there weren't costs of learning, we would all know everything. It's such a ridiculous starting point that I don't really know how we've done economics with that even vaguely in our heads for as long as we have. So those people who are thinking about rational inattention, when I started thinking about it, you would hear completely kooky lines from largely from theorists about how we've already done that. I think that meant they'd built a model in which there was a cost of learning, and so we're done. As opposed to, I walk around the world in a complete fog. Every single action I take is completely flawed because of what I don't have that I should have. And we need to study that from every single angle. It's shocking to me that there are so many different insightful angles. I mean, we were surprised to walk into the kind of posterior-based space and find it wasn't mined. So, like, that's very strange. Like, why wasn't that done? It's so obvious. And now this one is like the certainty equivalent done, and that's really cool. When I think about this and what I think is ahead, so I'm saying, what do I think is ahead? I mean, I think this is on a massive scale as a piece of economics. I think rational inattention and costs of learning are just everywhere. I think that they actually revealing that they're everywhere is the AI revolution, which is all about a machine that has a different cost function for learning that seems to be able to, rather important apparently, to be able to learn well. And it highlights some of the fog that we have in our heads. The thing I want to see happen is it becomes everyday economics. And for that, I do believe that the empirical side needs to come up. Now, the blessing of it is that these production functions for information in our heads should be findable. That is, it's the best applications of reveal preference type logic that you'll ever find, because you just keep presenting things to people and they keep showing that they don't understand them, and you just look at what they do that's a misunderstanding and you infer from that what they're finding difficult. So it's that direction of where you're headed that I would like to see. And I mean, which is okay, so can you use this, and you should be able to get a neat way of pulling costs out of the head. I think in the end, when you've done this, as I said to you, it's not going to be the same cost function that you'd find the way that I've inferred it. And, you know, my co-authors and I have found ways of inferring costs from state-dependent stochastic choice data, but that's ex post. Yours is an ex-ante method of, you know, recovering it using a very clever thing that substitutes for all my thinking. But I don't think I understand how much I think or how difficult it is. And I'm sure that there will be differences. And I'm sure that that will get us going on the next line of research, which is about, you know, well, what do we know about our own costs? And what illusions do we have? And I also want to point out the other obvious opening here, which is, you know, so here's the other line I've heard that is dismissive of rational inattention. And it goes roughly as follows: inattention, yes; rational, no. So that's a nice cheap line. What does it mean? Well, it means we already know that some of the Bayesian kind of conditions tend not to be true. So once you've made that joke, which is a good joke, the question is, so if people are non-Bayesian and have more complicated ways of updating, they still have to learn. They still have costs of learning. What are they doing? What's the right model, and how would you confirm it of a non-Bayesian? And I think that all of us should be pushing down that dimension too. And there isn't a behavioral answer. It's not just, well, I just say, you know, we're non-Bayesian. Like, well, we still learn. So I haven't seen the model that explains how somebody who's crazily overconfident learns. I mean, I presume maybe they don't, because, and they'll give very different answers to the questions you offer.
Yeah.
They'll say, you know, I'm going to get everything. What's your problem? I'm going to know everything, and I'm going to make a perfect decision. So what's your problem? So I just want to, I think digging into the revealed will chase out additional model elements, like I don't know my costs and I'm not a Bayesian.
Yes.
But that's going to be like, okay, let's tease that out.
So I'm currently thinking about something that's not quite going that far away from rationality. So I'll talk about this because I think it's interesting what you're saying. I don't have a good model to suggest either. But one question that's even like sort of closer to the rational inattention model already, but that I don't think we have a good answer to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just how the interaction between risk aversion and learning. So not necessarily overconfidence, but just risk aversion. Because even there, I don't think we have a good answer. Like if I just ask you, person A is more risk averse than person B, would person A learn more or less? He could make different arguments. He could say they will learn more because they don't like the risk and learning gets rid of the risk. Or you could say they would learn less because they're using safe stuff all the time, and so there are no incentives to learn. And so figuring out sort of which direction does it go. And again, it's a multidimensional object learning anyways. So maybe more or less is not the right way of asking the question. But that's something I find interesting. And though I wouldn't touch the non-Bayesian part, it shows that even within the Bayesian framework, I think there are still a lot of questions where we don't really have a good intuition for which way we think things would be going. As for the cost elicitation, I think that would be really interesting. So what I'm writing this grant proposal and trying to sort of use different approaches to get at the perceived learning costs from our perspective with this preference over menus and the sort of experienced cost of information using your approach, that would be really nice. So I think the reason why, so I talked briefly about that there's a tight connection between the cost function and the learning proof menu. I think what's really nice and what really holds a lot of promise for experiments is really through the self-selection property. So the idea that you can construct the learning proof menu point by point. Because if you want to figure out the learning cost, you have to find the learning cost for a signal, and the signal is so complicated already. And so with the way in which ignorance equivalence helps is because basically what I'm doing is I'm constructing point by point a curve that tells me what are the payoff vectors that make me no better off. Right? And then I know that even when I take them all at once, I'm still no better off because I can combine them in this way. And so that really helps me sort of make it in a way that could be possibly implemented. And the nice thing about it compared to existing approaches is you don't need then the same situation to observe multiple times to get the full state dependent stochastic choice data. And if you ask it the right way, you can ask it so that there are no incentives for early learning. So De Oliveras and co-authors also have a paper about eliciting learning costs, a theoretical paper, using preference over menus, but they are very explicit about the fact that their experimental protocol requires the experimenter to shut down learning. So you have to first choose over menus before you can possibly even learn. And that's feasible if learning is looking up stuff on the internet, then yes, you can just shut that down in the experiment. But if we're thinking about learning as a cognitive cost, then you cannot prevent people from thinking hard, right? And so the nice thing if we construct it in a way where there are no incentives for learning, because we only offer things that's at most ignorance equivalent, is that we don't have to worry about that. And so the hope is that it could make it feasible to also learn about costs, about situations where we cannot observe it multiple times and we cannot prevent the agent from learning more. So it could be possibly increase the applicability of it.
Okay, I think that's a very good time to stop the broadcasting and then maybe have a few offline